Thank you, sir. We'll do that. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm in a place where I'm probably going to be a little darker, a little lighter as I try not to move my head too much from the spot here as we go through. But thanks for everybody coming in tonight, and I hope this is helpful to get this out in a little easier format for you. To trying to two computer screens or whatever for some people might not be as easy to go through. I do want to make sure that you know where I've got at the end here. It's a pending at the end, and so that we can have some discussion. But I have laid out so that things are ready that we can fall through all of these. Of having the last column actually mean something if it's there, so we'll be able to turn it around rather quickly for next week's meeting. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to start general fund, and I will go to the back and then work back. I'll go to the final and then work the other way from there. Is probably the easiest way to do it. And I think if you look, as we talked when we went through general fund before, Curtis has spent a lot of time dealing with the state and looking through numbers to get the most accurate numbers that we can from the standpoint from them in what we should be expecting here in the next year. I think that a lot of the initial fears that we had last year did not come to fruition, but we still have that same mindset maybe going into this year. But we're going to go ahead and do based on what the numbers they say are coming, and we will continue to work through that way and then make the adjustments as we go forward from there if those happen in any other manner than what we expect. And I appreciate everything he's done to get a good breakdown on what those look, and we're looking at a little over 4 million when you look at our general numbers of coming in through both taxes and then through the state of Michigan and the different fees and other things that we have coming through. Adding in then the others from what departments bring in and different fees and the processes that we have throughout the city really gives us a total of a little over 4.5 projected revenue. Now, I would tell you that the appropriations that you see on your sheet is a little about 4.496. I did have a typo that I've went ahead and corrected, and I'll give that to you right now so that we know going in that if I look back on the economic development capital plan, I had typed in 328,300. That's high. It's supposed to be 238,300. So there is a slight difference in what the total will be as what we look at. So that's the parking lot resurface, the treescape project, the banner pole and cable, and the alley resurface. Those come out to 238,300, not 328. So it does make it just a little bit of different in our projected expenditures in general fund. About 4.4 is where we really look at from there. So, and those have been corrected on all the sheets here that I have in front of me too, so that you have a chance to look at them in a totality. I didn't want to try and go back and correct that 90,000 without letting you know that. I came across that when we were looking at it after I'd already printed these out to bring to you last night. So this is really, as we kind of talked earlier, it's almost like a zero-based where we let people look and say, look, what are your costs going to be? Before we had any projected revenue numbers, and we started to work from there. If you look, the numbers get themselves back in line with where we were in that 18-19 activity area. Some of that 19-20 activity area is still being corrected, and hopefully we'll continue to see that as we continue to find some more of the revenues that were misapplied to different places. And so those numbers are all going to be relatively close to within that area of what we saw with the increases. Not a lot of change from where everybody started, because I think, as we've talked, this is definitely the time to start zero-based and really look to how do we manage going throughout the year to make sure that those things are happening. And this is be our best opportunity to get our handle right on that right from the very get-go, starting July 1. So as opposed to me just going through every line item, I'm more interested in where your interests lie, and so that we can have a discussion about any of the lines, any of the things that you're looking at within any of the departments. A couple of the major changes that you would see that occurred this year would be when you look at finance administration, that incorporates now treasury, which used to be separated out, because we do have those coming directly out of general fund now, and looking at those. And human resources also now is its own and not a part of finance. So that's where those total numbers come from, a little bit different than what you may have seen in the past, are two of the major changes that you would see inside of this general fund budget. There's a lot here. I know it hasn't changed much since the first time we talked about it a few weeks ago. Just minor changes compared to where we were starting from. Oh, I know the other thing I wanted to make sure that everybody knew what we did. One of the areas I think we struggled with for a number of years is trying to figure out fringe and getting real deep into fringe at times, trying to guess what was going to happen with the insurance industry, trying to look at all the different things through fringe. This year in the discussion we had, we were taking a straight industry standard, 30% of salary is your fringe. And I think it's easier for us to adjust from there as opposed to trying to overguess and put things in place that that get way too deep in the weeds that we couldn't manage anyway. And so we're going to start at that 30%. We haven't had any other indications from the insurance industry that there's going to be that much change, but I think we've talked about 11% increases over the last couple of years, and it's never happened. So we're going to stick with that 30% industry standard and start from there this year. Across the board. That changes with different departments. If we have a lot of part-timers, we won't spend nearly as much fringe, but we still want 30% across the board of salary. I can give you some of the indications on the different salaries, what goes in there. There's some within different departments because we have people who work across lines. And so I don't want everybody to think everything's just straight one or two people within that, because Eric, for example, touches like a lot of departments here in the city. And so those have been broken down. If you look at the city manager's salary, that's mine. Portion of Eric and about 15%. Aaron, who works a lot for me, that 5%. In the finance department, we're looking at the plan that we've put out there of the positions of the director. You have the two accountant positions, the cash manager, and then a full and part-time cashier. But then they get split a little bit, some into the clerk's position because they're also deputy clerks. And so we've got the formulas all spread out for those. Elections, same way, including workers. And some of those inspections is really almost all of Aaron and part of Eric that go into that. And then the other new one was engineering this year that has not been, I won't say new, but it hasn't been a general fund. And we've already allocated out to all of the different funds, the salaries and that go into the street funds and all the other different funds. And then some specifically even into some other general fund ones, but that's really for the public service, the engineer and the clerk in that department. So that's another new one that was in this year.
Matt, this is Greg. Just a point of clarification. The document you gave us is labeled General Fund for year ending June 30, 2021. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that is
should be 2022. I just didn't change the date on that. My apologies.
That is in reference to the column 3, right?
Yeah, this document actually should say year ending June 30, 2022. It should be this year's. This is just a cover sheet that will go in the book. Right. Yes, thank you.
But then the column 3, the 2021 commission approved budget.
Yes.
That is an actual budget number. That's not year to date plus a projection.
No, these are last year's. Yeah, these are last year.
All budget.
Right. Because we're still working our way through that correction plan of everything on the year to dates.
I just want to make sure I understood that correctly.
Yep. I apologize. I should say June 30th, 2022. That probably threw you right from there.
Matt, I'm sure it's a page there.
Mr. Raj.
Under fringe benefits for 1920, there is a huge $256,000 entry where most of them are $1,500. I assume that's a mistake.
No, that's the one you asked me a little bit ago. That was the MERS payment that went out to MERS when we made the lump sum. To
Yes,
MERS.
I did. Thank you. Yes, I did. Yeah.
That's where that was
Okay.
allocated, and it
Okay.
is noted in the budget. So
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
you're welcome. Trust me, when I first saw that too, I was like, that's got to be a mistake. But then no, that is the MERS payment. The MERS
Okay. Thank you.
And I think a lot of the talk that Curtis and I have been able to have and went through this process is that this truly needs to be what we talked about the management, about looking at this from time to time and making sure that minimum quarterly, but probably more than that, especially making sure with revenues as to where they're coming in and that they're not sitting, that they're actually being applied quickly so we know exactly what's in the funds that we need to know. There is nothing in here about possibilities of any other funding through the American Rescue Plan. None of that kind of stuff is being addressed in here at all, of any of those. Try Dan to go ahead. Roxanne, you're gonna.
Well, I couldn't find the number you said to change. That was a typo. Can you tell me
Sure.
where the number?
Yeah, if you go to, it would be 101-728, which is economic development. So you're going to go down to, or down to the bottom, capital outlay, the 970. It says on the far right-hand corner, it's 101-728-0009.
Oh, yeah.
It says 328.3. That's supposed to be 238.3.
328.3. I thought I found it, but now I don't see that number.
Right in the, it's on the far right-hand side, Roxanne, capital outlay. There isn't anything for the first 3 years in there, but then the fourth year, there is the 328.3, and it should be 238.3. Which reduces the overall appropriations for that category to 319,560.
Okay. Thank you.
And I would like to, even though we talked about them, I'd like to hit a little bit back there again on to make sure that we're in a good spot with the capitals, because what we're looking at in general fund capitals are about $634,000. Find my sheet here. In capital plans for this upcoming year, and under the appropriations for the buildings and grounds maintenance, which is 101-265-970 capital outlay. We have put in capitals for $147,000. And that would include the refurbishment of one of the surfaces, the municipal parking lots. Of a parking lot, what I want to talk about a little bit is we have put in there the fire department PD drive approach out here at City Hall, which is in dire need to be fixed. And then there's some City Hall crack seal and a steel column that needs some work in the garage area of the Public Works. But the PD fire department drive approach realistically needs to be looked at from the aspect of the fire board, I believe. That's a definite fire. That's the heavy trucks from the fire department that have caused that. So I think we need to take this to the fire board to look at some kind of funding through them. And I know Danny and Greg, you're on the fire board, and I would assume that some of our talks recently, I would think that we'd be open to having that discussion at the fire board level.
Yeah, I guess that's a philosophical discussion because they've never contributed, fire board has never contributed to that in the past. And then we've got the complicating factor of, we're proposing a new building for the fire department. And if we start asking for money for maintenance on the garage that we built, does that mean that we're going to have to contribute to building a new barn and maintaining the barn that's
in somebody else's jurisdiction, right? But I think that's the leverage that needs to be there. If we've got this, we've got to make sure that there's an agreement, how that agreement flows to make sure that those are being covered properly.
I mean, with the precedents it's set, if it was a property owner and it was their driveway, they'd have to pay half, right? Isn't that kind of how we've handled it in the past?
Yeah, we would
with the sidewalks and things like that.
We could do it in that respect from there, but really with the fire board too, what we're looking at is there are funds in the fire board, which we contribute into. So it's still a part of our funds. There's no doubt in order to do that, but it's not jumping. But I get what you're saying, Greg, because if we are looking at the other building, at a point in time, you're 6 of one, half dozen of the other, and you want to make sure you're not just doing that or causing yourself more grief. So, but I do think that it needs to be addressed at the fire board level to know that this is major in comparison to just some of the smaller things that we generally take care of in maintenance. I don't know when we've ever done this last. I think David talked. I don't remember it being done since I've been here, and other than maybe that front apron area, but the whole thing's in pretty bad shape.
About 10 years ago, the fire board did help contribute paying for the city hall parking lot where the employees park. That's probably about 10. I don't recall how much was spent towards it from the fire board, but they did contribute some to that.
Okay, so it's just, I don't want to cut our nose off to spite our face. So like Greg said, when we talk about some other new buildings coming on where we make an agreement that ends up costing us more because of what we're paying for on their end too. But I just think it needs to be discussed with them and see what we can do with our costs.
I know Dave disappeared here, but that's a number we're gonna need. And if you can find that history,
yeah,
when we have that discussion at fire board.
I can try to go through some past budgets, or if there's a fire board budget we can go through to look for. But I know that was discussed and that was talked about because that's what helped us to pay for that parking lot back there then. So we can see what we can find on it.
It'd be nice to know the date because now we're talking about that parking lot needs to work again, right?
Yeah.
It needs crack sealed. We didn't do anything with the drive approaches back at that time. It was simply the asphalt surface itself.
I got to presume a large portion of that damage is because of those trucks as well.
Yeah. I
mean, your personal vehicles don't weigh much compared to those trucks going through there.
Yeah. The other, moving on to capital outlay here, then would be there's $50,000 for a police vehicle. We talked about that last time. That's the outfit included in that vehicle. That one a year at this point that we're looking at. 101,444, which becomes the public works and sidewalks portion, $149,500 in capital. We're looking at $80,000 for the sidewalk replacement, which we just approved, of which we would get 40 back in special assessments, and then the Charles Rail Trail extension to close up that loop. We have to get to that too. So that's the 149.5 there. The other one we're looking at is the plot layout in the cemetery. That's the 101,567 Riverside Cemetery. We talked about that earlier at one of our meetings with the plot layout for the new portions of the cemetery that have to be laid out. And then the big one for this year would be that economic development that we just talked about. That's 238, not 328 like I had. And that's a parking lot resurface, that treescape project that I think we would all probably agree is long overdue to get there and get that part done. And then, as we mentioned, the alley banner, poles and cables. Right now we have the banners that hang over down those cables. Those banners are all actually stuck to buildings of somebody else's. And so you put in something more permanent so we're not hanging stuff off of other people's buildings to do that. So, and then the last piece was that $25,000 to take the Highland area over here by the library and work that into something other than that sand pit that's never been really used for the sand, and be able to use that a little bit more by covering it and at least getting it covered, and then decide if we're looking at a court type thing or what we would be looking at over there.
Covering it with what?
I'm sorry, Greg?
What are you covering that with?
Well, we look to see if it's cement or what it is, but we're just putting some money in there to look at that to do.
I was looking at the idea of concrete, of filling that in, because there's a sand base in there. We probably had a little bit more sand in there to get it, but 4 inches of concrete. If you do asphalt, that doesn't tend to be as maintenance friendly. That'll have crack sealing. Then you have to seal it every 5 to 10 years. Concrete, you could pour it and forget it, and it'd be there for quite a while with a little maintenance. But that's that came up as a part of discussions when we were having meetings and things over there. So the idea was tossed out. So I put a number at it to see if that was something anybody was interested in.
But we'll talk about that before we do it then, right?
Right.
I mean, because I don't see putting a piece of concrete there for no purpose. I mean, it'd be nice to have a use for it and say, this is what the community wants to do here. To put a piece of cement down just to fill a space doesn't make any sense.
I missed what area you're talking about. Can you say again what?
It's the open area. Remember, it was going to be the sand volleyball area by the library.
The old swimming pool got
Yep.
filled in, right?
Yeah, it's the old
swimming pool.
at the community center, the old former community center site.
And yeah, that would be something. That's one that I know was put in, and we wouldn't do it. And for those of you, I guess we should say too, a lot of these capital projects get in and they sit and we make decisions on which ones we're going to end up doing through time. So it's just an introduction to that and to make sure that there would be input definitely before that, because it would have to be decided on what the use would be for that area.
Matt, you mentioned the downtown tree project and stuff. What are they doing downtown right now with the trees? They're doing something with cleaning them
Took out cleaning out all the beds and then put down mulch. So they cleaned out all the different beds there.
Okay, and that's it. That's all.
3/4 of them done right now, and then going to do that. Yeah, the downtown treescape plan would be actually bringing somebody in, work with the community to see what types of trees we're looking at. Where do you space them? How do you do that? We know we've got issues underneath that the old trees have cost, but everybody loves the canopy. But everybody loves the tree, but they don't want it in front of their place. And so it's bringing somebody in to work the whole community through this, work the downtown through it.
As long as they don't drop leaves in front of my place, you know, they have to clean it up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they've buckled up some sidewalks over the years. There's no doubt, and they've gotten into some foundations. So my understanding is years and years ago when these trees were brought, that there was a group just kind of together that made a decision. And I don't think anybody had the real foresight that knew these trees were going to do what they ended up doing. I don't think they were supposed to get that tall. They're supposed to do that, my understanding.
I've been told from people that were around at the time that the tree that was planted was not what was specified in the plan. And for whatever reason, the city did not hold the contractor accountable because it was supposed to be a dwarf tree that never got to the size that these are.
Yeah, those aren't dwarf trees, that's for sure.
Not by any stretch of the imagination.
Any stretch there, so. So that takes up about $634,000 of what we're looking at in capital projects there. And again, those capital projects, even though done, we would definitely bring back and talk about to make sure that before we're finalized on any of those. I'm not wanting to cut anybody off here either, so, but if we have anything else on those, we can have discussion there, but the restricted funds is what I'll get into next.
I'm good.
Again, this needs to be, this, as we talked about at one point, it's almost a zero base this year to look at and see. And definitely manage and see where we're at, but to do it on that quarterly basis, if not more. The restricted funds that we have within the budgeted areas are just it's really a peek at the cemetery and library endowment, but we're talking about the major streets, the local streets, and then the street improvement millage. And so most of this really ties into the capital projects that go along with the roads and with these. So, and the big one this year that we're looking at are really from the street millage fund, which would be, grab me, David, because I'm throwing back here, I believe Harvard and Richmond, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Are the two that we're looking there off of that fund to include there. Did find out, I think we'd had a discussion at one point about we break this down so fine when we get into surface maintenance, tree shrub replacement, all of these have different categories. And the reality is it is needed. Act 51 reporting asks for the numbers in this way. So that's why it's broken down so much into different areas. That's where we're at. These are funds restricted, can only be used for what the funding is for. Can't go outside of that. And so they're restricted to these things. And so what we've collected in the millage, being the major one, what we get in the Act 51 under the major and local streets, what's funded by the state of Michigan, has to be earmarked for these types of projects. David, do you want to give a brief about, because we kind of had this discussion a little bit last time, what are the major streets? What are majors compared to the locals?
Major streets are more your arterial ones. Those are ones you might recognize as those are priority ones for snow plowing. I can give you the whole rundown, but I can give you a gist of them. Superior Street is a major, Center Street's a major, all of the north-south downtown streets are major, North State Street's a major, Ely Street, Riverside, Bridge Street, Michigan Avenue, East End, Elwell, East and West Warwick Drive, and West Heather Lane are all major streets. Lincoln Avenue as well, and so is South Grover. Those are majors. The rest of them are locals, and then obviously there are alleys. But so we recognize them as three different streets. We have state trunk line, major streets, and local streets.
And the major push next year for that are those two, like about Richmond and Harvard being the ones that would be under the street village.
Correct.
Thank you.
Forgive me, Dave, Richmond, and I'm trying to remember, is there curb on that street?
Yes, there is on both Richmond is it's called integral curb, and that street is about that surface. Now, don't quote me, but that is quite an old street, and the reason I know that is because there's two different ways you can do it. You can do curb what we do now is curb is poured separate from the road. So you've got curb first, and then you put in the asphalt. That one has segments in the majority of the street. The curb is actually part of the road. So you couldn't mill it and then do spot curb replacements because the curb is actually part of the road surface. It's doweled in and it's one contiguous pour. So you can't really go in there and do any of that. It's got a different profile. Everything about that is different. So, and that's why that curb is in the condition that it's in. It's very broken up. You'll see the driveways kind of poured the way that they are on that one. It's in that east side of town. That's kind of common when you look at those. I know when we did, not Euclid Street, North Court up in there quite a few years ago when we did the water main project up there, we found that. So that's the reason why you can't do a mill, what's called a mill and fill on that, where you can mill out the road surface and then do spot curb replacements on that one. So that's the reason why that one comes out.
The curb is that asphalt curb. It's just a thicker layer of asphalt. Is that true?
Not on Richmond, I don't believe so. No, that I believe is integral curb, if I recall correctly. It is not a thicker asphalt one. It's not a bituminous curb. Where you're talking about, it's what we call it is a rolled bit curb, where it's about a 1 foot width, about 2 inches taller than the asphalt itself. That's more common on the south side of town.
So this is actual concrete that's somehow integrated into the road?
Yes.
So the road is concrete?
No, there's concrete underneath of that asphalt, but underneath of that 2-inch cap of asphalt that's on top of it, it's concrete. That's why you see so much crack. Why there's the one of the reasons why there's such a rough ride. There's an asphalt cap over that concrete road.
Yeah.
And I know we're in a budget time right now, but and maybe this isn't the right time to talk about it. But I am concerned with our recent practice for the last few budget years. When we've done some streets without curbs, we've gone in and put curbs in. And I understand that it does help with the lifespan of the road, and it helps preserve the road and gives you more options perhaps later down the road, but it is also extremely expensive. And it seems like, at the very least, we need to start getting a neighborhood participation to cover that. If they didn't have a curb existing, that the neighborhood ought to be participating in the cost of installing one. Similar to the way we do sidewalks, perhaps. If not outright paying for it.
Yeah, it depends on the length of, obviously the length of the street. That one, I can come up with a rough idea, but to put in curb on a typical street is typically when we spend it is about $20,000 is what we would have into the curb on the street in the scheme of depends on the surface itself, because we divide it under there's three different cost centers on it. We've got the road surface and storm included. Then the other one is the water and then the sanitary. So there's three different cost centers for each street project. But it does depend on the length of the street. And on Gulf side, that was the reason why we didn't do curb on that street, is because if we would have put curb on there, it would have been substantially more due to the amount of storm sewer that would have had to been replaced. So we look at that based on each street and the method of it. But for the short, it depends on the street, but for the majority of them, especially with these type of runs, I highly recommend the curb just because we can control water on it. It does make the road last longer, and it gives us a lot more options down the road for maintenance. But if we're looking at a long run, like if we add Grover to the list, that one would be very similar to a Gulf side. That one would be ditch construction and no curb on that one, no asphalt rolled bit curb. That would look very similar to what it is now. Few other streets that we may look at on that one, but for sure those interior collector streets like the ones we're talking about with Harvard and Richmond, I would still highly recommend the curb method, at least from my experience.
Harvard has curbs on both sides.
That is correct.
And those are the majors then that we're looking at for this year under the restricted funds of what would be going. And those, when you look on the capital sheets that you were given to, you'll see a lot of them run in together because, like David said, you'll have the road surface, which is some of the funding. You'll have the sewer, which is a portion of the funding. You'll have the wastewater, which is a portion of the funding. So whatever we're working on, you're going to see the capital improvement for each of those different areas within the CIPs in those areas.
Forgive me, but with the account, are we forced to do it that way in the accounting standards? Is that the only option we have?
As far as how we look at them?
Yeah, as far as, I mean, if we went in and, we said, we want to do this road, but what we really are after is to do the underground. Can we not then assign the street repair on top of it to that underground asset?
Yes, sir.
Depends which funding mechanism we use, but yes, that is an option, and we have done that on certain streets. If we are doing it, like, let's say, for instance, we're going to upsize the water main, Center Street for that portion, for that. Remember we did the Gawa project, Greg, I'm sorry. At Center Street, when we did that half, that was paid for exclusively under water. There was no separate street surface or anything like that. That water main paid for that portion of all of the above ground because it was strictly due to water main. Everything was ancillary related to that water project. Some of the sanitary projects we have done that too. If it comes to MDOT monies that we get, it does have to be separated. They will only pay for the road surface and anything that's stormwater related to the road surface. Nothing underground. MDOT does not care about utilities, nor typically does the federal government. They don't care about anything below ground.
Until, and I guess it's a good time I'll interject it, then you talk American Recovery Plan, because interestingly enough, that was one of the questions that kept coming out of that. If you're saying water, wastewater, and you dig down to get to the water, wastewater, what about the roadway? A discussion yesterday has now flipped that it does look like you can get the funding to do the entire package. That the roadway that you also deal with, because you've got to the water, wastewater underneath. So they're not going to limit you to have bad road to get to that. You're going to be able to replace it all under American Rescue Plan monies. So at least that was the latest interpretation yesterday. So we will continue to monitor those.
There still isn't clear guidance, right?
Yeah, that was The guidance yesterday was really fuzzy. It was basically if they don't prohibit, then you should ask. So we'll touch on that here before the end of the night too. So that seems to be coming down, hopefully sometime this week still, but we're getting there. If we can move into the enterprise funds that we have, and I do see on the enterprise funds page, I actually changed that to June 30th, 2022. So I actually got that one right to look through there. We had some talk a little initially the other night on State Street Plaza, of some of those things. The area I just wanted to make sure when we talk about State Street Plaza and the property there is, I do think it's one of those areas. If I can tell you this, when we talk to the railroad people, and I know that's a long shot, a long ways out, but when they talk about that, the city having control of that property right there is extremely helpful. When you look at hopefully future development along that area. And so that's, I know some people say, well, should we sell this? Should we do that? I get it. That's my only input I'd say at this point in time, unless we got closer to that, is to say that is a factor when some people talk about economic development, that be something that the city can hang on to in that area. I do think that the State Street Plaza, we've ran that on a shoestring for a while. Got some pretty solid renters in there now that we're bringing in, but I also think we'd be really mindful of what we continue to put into that building. I don't think there's any doubt on that as we look to the future of those. I got out of order here. For the most part, it's pretty close to still, we'll continue to try to get it to break to an even point where we can continue to make sure that we can do some of the minor things to it to keep it going. But I would say we probably, over the last 10 years, have at least a pretty solid group of renters now within the building. And if you don't know all of the buildings along the backside there, along the railroad area there, those are things that we're not putting money into really at this point anymore.
So if the roof is leaking, we're not fixing it?
No, I mean, if there's nobody in them really from that standpoint, I mean, if we have any major, but there's no planned things, we still do maintenance. I would say that, but there's no planned things within that building that we feel.
But they're vacant?
From there. Yes, for the most part. I think there's only one in there now out of all of those.
Mid-Michigan Railroad has still got an office in there.
Still got an office down on the far end. They're the only ones left in there.
Are they not usable?
We moved one person right out. We moved Centuria out of there and into the other building, which worked out best for everybody. I think that the investment would have to be pretty significant for us to make them again marketable. Usable and marketable, probably two different terms from there.
I guess to me, that just furthers the argument that we need to sell that property. You know, I get that it might perhaps maybe be sometime down the road some value, but on the other hand, you know, if somebody else owned it, it may spur that owner to develop something even further beyond what we're certainly willing to do. You know, we're not going to make, as you said, tremendous capital investments in there.
Right.
And somebody else might be inclined to, and perhaps on property nearby as well.
Good discussion to have, I believe, at a point. The water and wastewater, of which we talked briefly about the other night too, are the other two that there are a lot of needs that we continue to look through. And there's an awful lot of capital, as you see in there. Dave, I'm going to go ahead and roll with you here just because it's easier we'll continue on that and then we'll get on to the other ones, but I'll give you the opportunity because we have some pretty major things. If you look in the capital improvements plan on the backside of what we're seeing for both water and especially wastewater. And I know that we, after our discussion the other night, are looking in with OHM at some of that CBDG monies that could help. But I think this is an area that's priority two, even more than what we're looking at within these funds, that we probably definitely look at as we look to the American Rescue Plan from there.
Let's see here. I'm just opening up my slides, so bear with me here just a second. As Matt mentioned, we're looking at quite a few CIPs for wastewater. Some of those carried over from last year into this year. The CBDG grant, we just had a discussion today about that, trying to finalize that. You're going to expect to see that, or you should expect to see that on the next commission agenda for public hearing to discuss that. And then one of the things to keep in mind is how much are we willing to spend for match funds, minimum of 10%. But if you go up to 20%, it gets you more points to try to leverage that money. We're still looking at around $1 million based on our discussions. But we're looking at that sanitary project north of Washington Avenue. You may remember that from last year. Just no time with the COVID things going on last year, it was very difficult to try to find out where we were going and how things are going to move forward with that. So that was held off. As mentioned before, looking at talking with Pine River Township about perhaps having them acquire a generator for their lift stations out there in Pine River Township. We've had some discussions with them. They seemed open to that. That will be 100% reimbursed from Pine River Township if they choose to do that. Lift station roofs, if you remember back 2 weeks ago, I did talk about that. That number is significantly higher for the reason of some of those roofs are pretty bad shape. We want to make sure that they are going to structurally sustain putting new roofs on them. The idea is to put standard wood frame trusses over top of the concrete surface that is there, but there's at least a couple of them that are pretty far gone. We don't know if it'll maintain that structural load. So we put in a worst case scenario cost on that. I definitely do not anticipate spending that much on it, but that was just in case, and we do need those done. So I don't want any kind of issue with trying to hold those up any longer, trying to get that done. And doing all the roofs of the lift stations in 1 year, trying to capitalize and gain as much as we can instead of doing them piecemeal, 1 to 2 roofs each year, trying to just make that lucrative to a contractor to where they would do all of those in the same year. Disinfection conversion, that large number that's there, I don't anticipate spending that much, at least this year. I would like to look at having engineering consultants come through and do an analysis to find out what options we have. We've talked about doing UV. I know last year during the SAW grant, that was a direction we'd like to go. If that's still an option within the foreseeable future, I'd still like to propose going down that path. But if that's something that might be too distant off in the future, we're still looking at the idea of bleach conversion to get off of the chlorine. But that number is in there in case there is funds to move forward with it. I want to keep that on the budget, but at least start exploring that. Influent pump rigging, that was carried over from last year. Looked at what it's going to take structurally to do that. I think that number might be okay for moving forward, but that's so we can get the pumps that are in that existing pump station over there. Those are brand new, about 4 years ago, not 5 years ago now it's been. But when it comes time to do maintenance on those, and they do require maintenance, putting some rigging in there so that we can lift those things out of there and do the maintenance on them. Those things are quite heavy. They're about 4,000 pounds each. And I don't want them just swinging by a chain to get lifted up. I want them to make sure that they have actual structural beams that can support them. So there's been a lot of work into that to make sure that we're going to have a plan going forward that will structurally sustain those pumps when they do get lifted, and put holes in the floor that will be adequate and structurally supported enough so that we can have the hatches to get those out to do maintenance on those. And then obviously the Harvard and Richmond sanitary sewers is part of those street projects. Water meter replacements, that's the other one. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, I talked about half of that cost is borne by water. The other half is borne by wastewater, and trying to tear that into break that down into a 4-year project, potentially moving into a 5th year. But I don't want to replace those all in 1 year and have those all go bad at the same time. I'd like to try to space those out. So that when we do have to replace those in another 10 to 15 years, we can bite those off again in chunks.
One of the other, and will be coming to as part of the next meeting, will be we are going to ask for a 3% for water and wastewater increase, and we have not done one for a few years. These projects for this year are a significant amount that we'd like to really start getting to. And so making sure that and even with that, you're not keeping ahead of where we were at with that. But I think a full analysis of what may be available under some of these other plans and some of these other structures out there over the next year, 2 years, actually, almost into a third year, will give us a much better idea of where we need to be in the next 5 to 10 years.
And the water portion of that, you'll notice on that one, I have North State Street. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. Upsizing that existing 4-inch water line that is not enough water to supply for that hotel project that's going to go in there. The idea of that is to put a 12-inch there to connect Superior Street and Center Street, putting a 12-inch to make another connector of an arterial water main downtown that will help with fire suppression. Water flows through the downtown, and that will, like I mentioned, interconnect 12 inches so we don't have a gap in between. And that kind of came on spur of the moment there a couple months ago, looking at some ideas, but it's gone on now to where we can push it to next year's budget after July 1st. The meter replacement program, as you remember me discussing, elevated tank paint repainting. If you remember a couple weeks ago, I talked about that. It's going to be a large undertaking. We are no longer at the point where we can just put a coat of paint over it. It's got too many coats of paint on it. It now has to be sandblasted off and repainted. So that'll be significantly higher than it's been in the past for the repainting of that. It's part of it too, replacing the cathodic protection so that the surface lasts longer, and that's the sacrificial diode for it, so it helps limit corrosion. Water main abandonment and interconnections, carrying those over, and then water main replacements for Harvard and Richmond Street. Those coincide with the street reconstruction programs. Same thing as the wastewater that you would see from the wastewater projects. But that's what but the bigger one that's not normal for this budget season is going to be, once again, those water meters and the elevated tank repainting project.
David, can you mention too a little bit about where we're pretty sure, and I'm not sure if we ever assigned a number to it when we were meeting with all the water meter guys, but I mean, of how much we're probably losing in revenue too, as our meters have gotten older?
We lose the numbers in my mind are, it depends on the size of the meter, but the larger meters for the larger users would be college, not really so much, but definitely the hospital, Masonic home, that type of thing, those in large industries. I think the numbers, if I'm quoted right, Matt, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we could be recoup just in the first year if we focus on our large water main or water users, the largest consumers. We can actually pay off those meters in the first year just by dealing with our largest suppliers. That's how much water you stand to lose by having not accurate meters. The meters that we're looking at replacing, these are going to be direct reads, so we don't have to have a meter reader. Eventually phasing that out would be nice. And we can directly read those right here by clicking on it at a remote workstation. The meters we're looking at getting, you do not need to have them recalibrated. They're what they're called ultrasonic meters. That seems to be the new industry standard. They are guaranteed accurate. They either work and they're accurate, or they don't work. And they work for about 15 years. The battery life is anywhere between 10 and 15 years. The ones that we are looking at buying, we can do maintenance on. We can replace the batteries if they go bad. The other ones that we are aware of, if the battery goes bad, you throw the meter out. But this one, we can still put in a $12 to $15 battery and still keep it going. So if any reason the batteries die, we can still replace those, and you don't have to have the meter recalibrated. It works by actual sonar. There's no spinning devices in it. That's one thing that will help our customers, in that if they have if they have old water lines and any of that rust or anything breaks loose, there's no risk of it plugging this meter, because it quite literally is there's no obstructions, there's no spinning parts. So it's about the same size as like a garden hose, and there's nothing that will get stuck in it. So if there is any kind of problem with their pressure or volume, it will be nothing to do on our end. It can't be because of the meters once we get these replaced. But there's no accuracy issues. Once they're in, they're in. When they're not accurate, they don't read, and you replace them. Costs are about $210 to $250 per standard 3/4 inch water meter. Prices will go up based on the large ones, but the large water meters, the 4-inch and up, even 2-inch and up, but definitely the 4-inch and up, pay for themselves within the first year by the amount of money we recoup. So with the water meters that are out there, they are outdated. We are having a number of problems with them. And this has been something we've talked about for the last 10 years that needs to be done. But we are at the point now we have to start doing something with them. Unfortunately, for the users, for the water customers, the inaccuracy is usually more beneficial to them. So when we replace the new ones, they're going to see most of them will likely see a slight increase because they are more accurate.
And that's why we've had the discussion that we would in our first round definitely look at our large consumers in order to make sure that we start getting that back right away as quick as we can. So thank you, David. I know it's a lot to swallow all at once. Appreciate it. The transit services under the enterprise funds. As we know, there's change this year with the expansion that's going on, which increases revenue, which will increase everything else as far as how many people we're having to hire, how many we're putting in there. In order to do it again, this was done. I would say that the fringe is probably high because we have a lot of part-time workers there. But again, we use the 30% straight across the board for where the salaries are on this. From there moving forward, I think this is pretty accurate when we look at and give a better explanation as to when we talk about where we have taken and what we're doing with the accounting portion of that. This isn't a new position, and this will be considered new in the way we're doing it, but the city has always handled the accounting portion for transit. This is actually identifying a way to split the cost of a person that we know can help in finance, because it also takes away this burden that we've always put on finance by trying to deal with something that somebody just didn't have the knowledge of and splitting that cost. So we'll be direct costing those folks back to transit, which is an outside enterprise fund and not from the general fund. That will help to assist there. And the same thing with the amount of time that human resources is spending there as we are going through the process of drivers and especially with the expansion of putting that back into salaries also. So there's another increase there that will help us pay for some of what we need here in the city too out of general fund in order to do that.
Matt?
Yeah.
Is there a way on the estimated revenues? I mean, we've got, real property, personal property, federal operating, state operating, fare box collections, contract fares, special fares. I don't know what that is. At 36,000.
That used to be part of the specialized service, which is all now incorporated into operating fares.
So which one again is the expected revenue to come from Slipper?
They would be listed. Let me go through them just so you know. The federal operating grants basically is based upon your expenses you're going to get back from both the federal and state government. They used to be called the 80% group because you'd get almost 80% back of your expenses from them. It's nowhere near the 80% group, but it's still, Brett, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're still in that 63% range that you're still getting back.
With this fiscal, due to the CARES Act, we're at 74%.
Okay, that does come back from there. Fare box collections are just those. Those are people getting on your bus, putting in your fares. When you look at the contract fares now, that's where we're looking at, and I would assume what we're looking at there is some of GIN, which is the mental health runs, and then the contracted into Slipper and the group that we're working with there, Greg.
Is there a way, I mean, can we add, you've got 3 more digits on your budget line items. Can you split those out?
We'd have to create a new, but yeah, they could be, because they would just have to be created in a new.
You've got 3 more digits there to add. You could, on the tail end of your budget numbers.
Yeah, we could even sub it underneath there on those last 3 zeros.
I think it would be helpful to monitor that separately.
Okay. Yeah, that's not, we could sub that right out. Correct, Curtis? I won't say anything that's not true, but yeah, I think we could sub that right down.
That is correct. We can add sub accounts for those.
Okay, thank you. The other enterprise fund is the refuse collection. And as we talked a little bit about before, we are kind of getting close to the end of this contract. And I think it's something that needs to be explored heavily as we move forward here. And I'm not really looking at the numbers. I think you're looking at more about the service issues. And I don't know how much you folks hear about it, but we definitely hear about it here. And when we talk about our refuse and our contract with Republic, I get it. The community doesn't understand that we have a contract with somebody because it's us and they feel it's us. And so the questions that we get from folks definitely have to do with when they're late, when stuff's not getting done. And I would say that we've, over the last year, have fielded a lot more than we used to. It's gotten to that point. So I think we definitely need to look. But I will tell you, all indications are that wherever we go, whatever we do, you are going to probably going to the CART plan. I think you're going to find it really, really difficult to find anybody any business, Granger, Republic, any of them that aren't going to CART plans, which is an increased cost. And so we really need to make sure that we're exploring the service area for that. I think that's going to be essential as we go forward. I also think as you're talking to residents, if people have questions, they need to understand that they do pay for this. A lot of people don't understand that when you're talking about their leaf collection, when you're talking about the things that the brush collection, they are paying for that within this. When they get their utility bill, it's a portion of that. I know we in the past have talked about some of the things we looked at last year when things were a little scary at the beginning of this whole thing of should we be doing leaves and could we cut costs there? I think this community, separate than other ones around us that don't do it every week, don't do brush every week. I just think that's something we're going to have to continue to work that way. I think it's something that's expected in this community. And so we continue on that cost. That's definitely here. But those are the things that are inside of this that I don't think when you think refuse, you don't realize there is the contracted service for the refuse and the recycling. But then we also do have in there, you're talking about yard waste. You're talking about the compost site out there, the leaf collection that we do all year, or that we do in the fall. And so all of those things are continued in there. We're planning on hopefully being able to build a little more, around 63,000 into the fund this year. But I think we're going to have to look at it much different over the next 2 years when this changes, because I believe we're headed to carts no matter where we go. But that's a cost also the two probably has to be passed along as we look at our rates.
Matt, a couple things come to mind when you talk about that. And I know we're accustomed to the luxury of having, curbside yard waste collection every week all summer long. I'd want to know what is the projected savings if you went to a monthly collection cycle rather than a weekly collection cycle. Is it significant? And I don't expect you to know that off the top of your head.
Oh, that's a good question, Greg. And I think that the way becomes, is it significant enough to handle what the expectations are that have been set there? I agree with that. I think you'd have to look and see that it's significant enough to make an impact that people would understand, because we are the only community in this area that does it that as often as we do. And I do think it makes a difference. I've been in other communities when somebody's stuff's been sitting out for 2 weeks, and that's acceptable in that community because that's the way it's been. And so there would be a heck of a learning curve for folks. I get that, but it would be a savings. But good point. We have to weigh that. What's the balance right there?
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking, $15,000 instead of 60, that's a discussion we're going to have. If you're talking 50 instead of 60, it's a different conversation, I believe.
Correct.
And then I guess the other thing is I know we've talked over time, the recycling pile, the composting pile is an expensive process. What are other communities doing? Does everybody have their own piles and they're experiencing the same things that we are? Ithaca, St. Louis?
I don't know that. I'll have to look into that and find that part out to see what they're doing in some of the composting areas. And I don't want to put Dave on the spot and just say answer that right now, because I'd have to look into that and see what they're doing too.
Yeah, and again, I don't know, but if somebody's got a better idea or a better way to do things, I don't know if there is one or not, but
if somebody's interested in taking it over or taking our piles, we very much definitely look into that conversation. We've had that in my career here. That conversation has happened 3 times, but people show interest, and then when it comes down to the end process of making it happen, they always seem to shy away. We're looking at there's always options where people want to take it and compost it and sell it. We're always open to that, but yeah, if you know anybody that's interested in the business, we can talk about it.
Yeah, and I don't, but I do hear, very complimentary things about the end product, that the compost is a very high quality, very clean, very nutrient rich. So people like it, but
yeah, and I've heard a lot of that too. I mean, people really like that option of going out there and doing it, but it does come at a cost. There is no doubt.
maybe that's, what does it cost to bag the stuff and sell it?
Sell it from, yeah.
I mean, I don't know what a bagger would cost, and somebody to bag them up and seal them, and is there a market for it? I mean, people go to the store and buy bags of compost all the time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
It would be nice if somebody would actually come in and truck it and do that, because we have talked about that internally. The problem is, if we talk about selling it ourselves, we're worried people won't buy it. And according to our permit requirements, we have to get that. None of that material can be on site any longer than 3 years. So we have to constantly keep material moving. So if it doesn't sell and doesn't move, then we're going to have to pay somebody to truck it off site. So that's always the catch-22, is if we sell it on a scale from us, would anyone buy it? Our product, or our policy is, or at least our goal is, to get rid of it, because once we have that topsoil pile, that black dirt, we want to get rid of it. So that's our biggest goal, is to get that off site. And if somebody looked at back a number of years ago, there was an excavator that came in and actually hauled it all off. And that was, so if somebody wants to look at buying it, if that type of scale, that would be more than useful for us. We'd definitely be interested in it. But problem is, the cost isn't much, it's the cost in trucking it. So when people look at buying it, I don't know how much we would actually get from that. But so those are the issues that we would have with it, at least that I can think of off the top of our head. But I'm open to any kind of ideas if there's any creative ideas for it.
Let's see. There's really, in a nutshell, of what the plans are and what we're looking for over this year. And I know there's a lot of proof in the pudding that has to happen over this year. Because again, I think we've established a good baseline, but the reality has to be about how the baseline is managed. And that will be the important part to see where we're going. And I also think the important part is going to be, how do we manage the influx of this next bit of revenue that comes in? Not just because it seems to still be swirling, but I think some expectations are going to be pretty heavy. And so how we determine what we're going to do with that, and again, how does it best stretch our other dollars here too, and provide for the community what we need to do, is going to be really essential for us going forward.
I like the position that we are in right now, with having started with, again, a zero-based balance, or a zero-based budget in here. So everybody has put in what they think they're going to take, and it wasn't taking last year's budget and adding 12% or something like that to it. This should be real, and people should be held accountable for it. The next portion is that we have to, as we have said over and over, we have to monitor this and not come up with 11 months from now with a holy cow attitude, what happened here? Just to watch this all the time. And the third thing that I like is that we have not included any of the additional income that we could potentially get, so that if we do get that, that's all gravy at this point. We have a balanced budget. We have a nice looking budget. And if somebody wants to throw us an extra couple $100 that we hadn't counted on, that's great.
That's really become the recommendation too. It is ironic that the first talk about this influx of money was line up your contractors, get going, and move as quickly as you can. That is a complete opposite of what the rhetoric is now. It is plan it. Make sure that you're doing things that are the best. I will tell you, when these numbers come out, it appears that the initial numbers for Michigan that you've probably all seen, that we've talked about, of the $877,000, The villages were missed in Michigan's first allocation amount. So that's been reset back to now allocate for the villages. What I was told is that it's pretty apparent the federal government didn't really have a very good grasp on how local government works. And so the idea of how they would just distribute the money would be simple. Think about it. Every state's their municipalities are all completely different as to how they function. And there was ties up in certain parts, especially if you look at the Northeast, where you have counties are much different. They are a municipality much different than what we have, a lot of things. So there was a lot of that's going on. And so 2 more webinars or the thing from the NLC by the end of this week, and they're hoping that the final things will come out at least so that we can start to put those things together here soon. But Roger, you're right, it doesn't change what we're planning from here. Those would be the things in addition to that we could do. And it's not that they're not important, because we could get some extremely important things done that I really think, as opposed to looking right now that 5-10 years down the road didn't have to be funded, that we can fund now. But there's no doubt, we know that prices are just elevating beyond as we're taking some bids and going to start, we put the bid things out, talking about the bathrooms and doing some of that. We know those prices have gone well above where we had anticipated. So that's going to have to be looked at. And so we're going to look at that through this lens also. Is that something that we could use and make sure that we push that? I would I'd be preparing, I would say thank you, and I would be preparing then resolution that we would be at a point to look through these at the next meeting. To get there, as long as I got everybody here, I think it's worth a talk of where we're at with meetings. I think probably through at least the next meeting, if not 2, we probably need to stay right where we've already planned with Zoom, but a little more thought as we go forward here about when do we start to open things back up, at least from a meeting standpoint. I think a lot of things are opening up, but it becomes that question of when do we do that next. So I'm open to any input on that too, as to your guys' feelings. I sure don't want to put anybody in any kind of position that makes them uncomfortable.
Matt, I don't have a problem meeting in person. I just wish we had a space we could spread out a little bit.
And I do think we've got some items coming up. If you haven't probably already been informed of some things that we know are coming up, they'll go to the Planning Commission first, that probably maybe we can make some, because I do think some of these things that may have a lot of public input, we need that space. We need to be able to have that as opposed to a Zoom meeting. And so if we get it out in time, and Sarah, if I'm saying something wrong, please let me know, but it's a matter of where we have the meeting. If we can partner with the school or somebody to get a larger space, that we could do that. I think it would be important, especially for some of the items that may be coming up soon.
That sounds good.
Problem is spacing us and then also spacing others within the small space that we have here.
Right.
So, and now Aaron's edgy to get his, for this room to become what we are liking to see it as, but, and I think it will help us through this, but I still think we're, a little ways from that. So.
Our places that are, where we meet currently at City Hall, we just are very, very close together.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at even our, up front, we're all right there. And so you can have about 3 people in the audience, and that might be comfortable. And so I think if we make that decision, it is partnering with somebody. I know that the school board's had some meetings in the auditorium, and they've started to open some things up to look a little bit different, but I think you need that kind of space in order to do it.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I thank you. It's been a hell of a process to get to where we're at, and it's a good base, but it has to happen from here on, and to monitor that, and you need to see it monthly, if not quarterly, if not monthly. And we've had that talk. Curtis and I are putting that plan together to do that, to make sure that those are all here. All right. Okay, I will I guess we don't have to adjourn. There's no
No
formality.
adjournment, no, we're not
Okay.
following Robert.
Thanks, everybody.